camera here. Look, thingy. Okay.
Well, answer that question.
Camera here. Look. Okay. We are now live. Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. I think it's time for us to talk about geoengineering from a different angle, don't you? We've been talking about the technology and whether it'll work and how much it'll cost and where to put it and all that sort of stuff. But the main question is, should we do it? And if we do it, who should organize it and regulate it? Because some people think, well, we'll just let buccaneers go out there and start playing with it. But most people say it really needs governing. So our topic today is how to govern geoengineering if we ever get around to even trying the thing. I have three guys here who fortunately, they know each other. So it's going to make it easier for me as a moderator because they probably are in the middle of a conversation that they started 10 years ago and need to finish today online. But if not, we'll prod them and see where they are today. Okay, I will introduce you first to Daniel Bodansky, who is Regents Professor at Arizona State University and the author of The Art and Craft of International Environmental Law, which sounds like right up our alley. In UK is Robert Chris, whom I have met before on this show and elsewhere. He is an associate at the Open University in geography and an associate of the Center for Climate Repair at Cambridge University. That's, I think the thing at Cambridge is really the most promising and maybe most impressive and influential organization working on climate repair anywhere. But we'll see. And in the Netherlands is Jesse Reynolds, who is now associate with something called the Degrees Initiative, which is apparently an NGO in Britain. And he is the author of a book called The Governance of Solar Geoengineering. The subtitle is Managing Climate Change in the Anthropocene. So we're well into the Anthropocene and we better get to work on managing things. Hello, gentlemen. I don't know where to start. It would be interesting to know where you were when you all were in touch with each other last, because I gather that you haven't for the last 2 or 3 years been talking to each other. But have you had a preliminary conversation about this issue, how to govern geoengineering? If you've already started a discussion, tell me where you stood on the issue when you last were talking about it. And if you're not, I'll have you start at some other point. Who can bring me up to speed on where you've been?
So we haven't really had a conversation on governance of geoengineering. I think I last saw Jesse at the climate conference of the parties in Sharm el-Sheikh when Jesse was starting in the midst of the Overshoot Commission, which he was, I think, the executive director of, and they were doing a presentation on their work. So they were a high level, well, Jesse can tell you more about it, but a high level group that was looking into geoengineering issues. And Robert, I last met actually at Cambridge because I also work with the Cambridge Center for Climate Repair. But I think when I saw Robert, we were discussing methane's greenhouse gas, global warming potential, which he was working on at the time. So I think we are starting a conversation rather than continuing one as far as I know.
Okay. Do you remember that, Robert?
I do indeed. It was a very, very glorious summer outing in Cambridge. We had beautiful weather and our hosts were very generous and the beer was very good too.
Okay. And Jesse Reynolds, have you been in conversation about this issue with either of the other two gentlemen so far?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in touch with Dan about the topic of geoengineering more on and off over the last few years. And I got to say, when I moved into this topic, I returned to academia at a somewhat late age. I was in my mid-30s and so, and I think Dan's academic work was a significant influence on my thinking, as it struck me as how to put it, clear-eyed, a pleasure to find such a clear-eyed view in international environmental law that has such a slice of realpolitik mixed in, an appreciation of both what is ideal and what's possible. So thanks, Dan, for that. And Robert, I last saw at one of the climate engineering conferences, either 2014 or I think 2017, and it was the last day there, and it was the day, the evening that we all spent at the bar. So I'm not sure exactly how that ended up wrapping up.
Yeah, that was 2014 in Berlin. Yeah.
Oh, so it's been 10 years, I guess, since I've been in touch with Robert.
2017.
Well, there have been lots of developments, of course, technologically. Lots of people come up with new ideas of how maybe we can save the ice in the Arctic and things of that kind. We could talk about what you think is promising as realistic scientific innovation, but I think mostly we need to talk about how to regulate, if we should regulate the developments. There have been cases in the last couple of years when some people have tried even very, very trivial kinds of geoengineering experimentation and have had their wrists slapped for not getting proper authorization. I think in Scandinavia it happened with the Sami people. I believe that David Keith started some really minor, there's no risk involved really, but some kind of experimentation that was going to be taking place in the far north, and the Sami people objected because he had consulted with, as I understand it, with the army, but not with them. And they feel they should have a veto over that. And that's a good question. Should they have a veto? That may be one question we should address, because I've heard mixed opinions about whether the indigenous people or the people living who are most affected by a potential innovation, whether they should have a veto over doing it. And of course, more recently, there was an experiment done in Alameda, California, which again was no risk whatever, but the people in the community stopped it, prevented it, at least for the time being. I think they went ahead and finished later when everybody was reassured that there was no risk whatever. So we see that there has to be some way of stopping people, or there are ways of stopping people who have plans to experiment. And of course, when it comes to full-scale deployment, I hear very few people saying we should go ahead and start the real deployment of any of these innovations. I think my impression is that maybe Hugh Hunt at Cambridge is a little bolder in saying, let's go ahead and start small, and then if you find you have a problem, then you can stop it, and you're learning along the way. Okay, those are, that's sort of the area of discourse that I think we should start with, and then you can go wherever you want. Any comments on what I have just mentioned, please?
Well, I guess I just maybe initially draw a couple of distinctions. So I would distinguish between governance of research and governance of deployment. There's a continuum. So I think when Hugh Hunt says maybe we should be doing deployment, I think it's sort of research, but at maybe a larger, you're ramping up the research, so it's having a larger effect. So there's a continuum there, but I think there is a distinction that's important between governance of research and governance of deployment. I mean, at least in my view, we don't know nearly enough about the feasibility, the effectiveness, the risks of geoengineering to actually deploy on a large scale. So I think discussions of governance of deployment, in my mind, are premature because we don't really know enough about it at this point. But research, I think, governance is something that should be discussed sooner rather than later. And there's, I think, really a strong need for more research so we understand it better, so we're in a better position to understand whether it makes sense to do it or not, as the case may be.
Well, there are people who don't even want any research, and they're even trying to make legislation along those lines.
I think the point that you're just making there is very, very important, Meta, because the examples you gave earlier on, the research was not stopped in any of those cases. Indeed, not even in the case of, excuse me, of the research that Hugh Hunt himself was trying to do some years ago, that was stopped. In none of those cases was there any environmental risk associated with the projects at all. They were doing research on various enabling technologies and ideas around the processes, but there was never any question of releasing anything into the atmosphere that was going to do any harm. I think Hugh Hunt's original experiment involved spraying water into the atmosphere. I think that Scopex was going to do the same sort of thing. So what those examples illustrate is precisely the point you just made, that the objections to geoengineering that have so far stopped the research are not about the risks of the research. They're about the general principle of geoengineering itself. And they're very much in the nature of the kind of the slippery slope or the wedge argument that you don't want to start doing this because once you start, it's going to grow and it's going to get out of control. So the place to stop it is right now. And it actually, to me, just to finish off, it illustrates that really there's a prior question before we get into the detail about what the governance should look like, whether it's for research or for development. The prior question is geoengineering necessary? I mean, do we really need to do this, or is it just a nice to have? Because if the decision is that we don't really need this, we've got other tools in the box to address climate change, and geoengineering in whatever form would be nice to have, but it's not really essential, then you're going to have one set of standards for dealing with it. But if, on the other hand, you say, hey, listen, guys, if we don't do the geoengineering, we are almost certainly going to have some kind of catastrophe in some, later in the century or whenever, then the imperative and the pressures are somewhat different, and the standards that will apply will also be different. So I think this prior question, which is very much a risk management question, for me, it's it's not an ethical question. It's not even a climate science question. Certainly not a legal question. It's simply a risk management question. Is geoengineering necessary to deal with climate change? And what are the risks? What are the relative risks of doing it and not doing it? And only once we have a view on that can we move forward.
So I would say, though, that a lot of the objections are really not based on any actual assessment of risk, because I think if you do a risk assessment, we should certainly be going ahead with the research. I think it's a prior question, actually, philosophically, whether you should even allow contemplation of geoengineering as an option. I think some of the opposition is not based on any actual, real analysis of a risk framework. Because if you look at the risk framework, the risks of not doing research, which is we won't stop climate change, there'll be, very damaging climate change. We won't know much about geoengineering, so countries might decide to go ahead with it, not even knowing whether it works or is safe. So there's, huge risks of deployment of geoengineering that's, actually extremely damaging. The risks of not doing research and not knowing much about it are huge, whereas the risks of doing research, I think, are very minor by comparison. The main risk is that it will undermine the will of states to reduce emissions, which is something unproven, is I think pretty, in my view, is a much lesser risk realistically than the risks of not doing research. So risk, I don't think really would lead people to say we shouldn't be doing research. But I think a lot of people just don't like the concept of people interfering with nature and just find that unacceptable to begin with, so they never really get to the risk framework.
If I can jump in with a couple of compliments to what's been said thus far. First, Dan made an important distinction between the regulation or the governance of the use of solar geoengineering and its research. I would add another important distinction, and that's the distinction between governance that is specific to geoengineering and governance that has existed for years for other purposes that would be applicable to geoengineering. One often hears the claim that there is no governance of geoengineering, there is no regulation, there is no law. And that's not true, because both large-scale outdoor research and the possible use of geoengineering would be governed by existing laws and rules and institutional norms that would apply to other somewhat analogous activities. That's not to say that there's no gaps in the regulation. There are, of course, gaps. Second, Chris brought up actually responded to Meta's points about the 3 scuttled outdoor experiments of solar geoengineering. It's worth adding that not only did those 3 experiments pose 0 environmental risks, they were scuttled not for violating any rules of governance. They were not contrary to the law or the practices of the universities or the funding agencies in any way. They were scuttled because ideological opponents of solar geoengineering research leveraged salient issues, whether it's patents and the possibility of conflict of interest, or whether there's sufficient engagement with the local public, who of course wouldn't be environmentally affected because there is no environmental effect, but they do live in the area.
Okay, tell me, if you will, it's a big question. You say that it isn't that there are no laws, but maybe not enough. But what are the laws? What are if there are regulations that would do something to control the situation? Tell me about them, because I don't know anything about the international environmental law that would apply here.
Dan, would you like to begin? You're the author of the international law textbook.
So there are general principles of international environmental law that would apply to geoengineering activities like any other. So there's a general norm to use due diligence to prevent significant transboundary pollution. So to the extent that geoengineering caused or was likely to cause had a high significant risk of causing significant transboundary pollution, then that norm would be implicated. If you're doing something, an activity, if an activity in the territory of a state or under its jurisdiction might cause significant transboundary pollution, then the state is supposed to do an assessment, is supposed to provide notice and consultation with other potentially affected states. So these are general principles of international environmental law that apply to whatever a state was happening in a state or under its jurisdiction, and would apply to solar geoengineering.
How are they enforced? I mean, do states sue each other, or there's no international police to go after anybody? So how would, if I don't like something another country is doing in affecting what I think is my environment, what could I do about it?
So enforcement has never been the strong suit of international law. So I would say they are, so they can be used in various ways, though. So they're used in diplomatic discussions. They can be used by domestic environmental groups that are pushing governments as a point of leverage to try to get better policies within a country. They can be, the possibility of lawsuits is extremely limited, although if you can show a direct transboundary effect, you might be able to sue in your domestic courts. That would be a possibility. So I would say they're subject to the same limitations as international law generally. So this is not unique to geoengineering. There's a international environmental law. International law generally operates, not so much through direct enforcement, but by changing people's perceptions, by affecting domestic politics, by affecting a state's reputation internationally. So these are, those aren't going to be really solved by any governance proposals, because I think it's very difficult to imagine any governance structure that would fundamentally change the sort of the limitations of international environmental law.
Well, okay. Now, my impression about international law is colored by my sense of outrage that, for example, the ICJ, when it tells Russia to stop aggressing in Ukraine, they just it totally ignore it and nothing happens. So is it sort of like that? Tell me if you can think of a case where international law actually made any difference, whether somebody invoked it in some sort of treaty negotiations, or decided to put sanctions on each other, or how has it ever mattered, to be really rude? I dare you to show me that there's any difference in the world for having international law.
So, I mean,
Well,
the most spectacular success is the Montreal Protocol, which deals with ozone depletion. So, it has regulated what countries are allowed to do in terms of the use and production of ozone depleting substances. Ozone depleting substances have been largely phased out as required by the Montreal Protocol. So, in terms of saving the ozone layer, I think the Montreal Protocol has been very effective. But that's, I think, true to a lesser degree.
Sorry, excuse me, that's the ozone thing,
Yeah,
right? Uh-huh.
yeah. But I mean, so you were asking if there are any examples. So, I would say trade in endangered species are still an issue, but the ban on elephant ivory has reduced the demand for elephant ivory in some of the states. And so there's still issues, obviously, with trade in endangered species. But if you think of what would happen with no agreement versus what's the case with the agreement, I think the agreement's helped. I think the wetlands agreement, these are not specifically on geoengineering, but there's an agreement on wetlands. The wetlands are now viewed quite differently than they used to be viewed. They used to be viewed as swamps, disease-infested places. Now they're called wetlands rather than swamps. They are seen as providing all sorts of ecosystem services. I think that transformation in people's perceptions, was influenced by the development of the Ramsar Convention and the then incorporation of Ramsar into domestic laws and so forth and so on. So it's not it's not like criminal law domestically, where you have a law and somebody violates it and there's police who arrests you and puts you on trial. The ways that it affects behavior are much more attenuated, I think. But that's not to say that it has no effect on behavior. It's just that it's more complicated how it eventually affects behavior.
Okay, thank you. Now, if somebody gets away with this business, I've heard them, it's said that people are now trying to enact legislation prohibiting any kind of geoengineering flat out. If they succeed with that, will that also have an impact?
Well, the legislation that I'm aware of is somewhat orthogonal, if you will, to what we're discussing here. There's a couple of U.S. states where there's a sufficient mass of state legislators who are swayed by conspiracy theories, or they're swayed by the voters who are swayed by conspiracy theories. I don't know about the legislators themselves. That some sort of secret geoengineering program has already taken place, and maybe it's spraying some sort of substance into the atmosphere that affects people and such nonsense. And the only state I'm aware of where that actually passed was Tennessee. A few weeks ago, legislation was considered some years ago in Rhode Island to that effect. And that is, for lack of a better word, nonsense. In terms of the sort of solar geoengineering to regulate the climate, the closest that's occurred is the case of Mexico, which had a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to something of a stunt that was conducted within its territory. And it announced in a press release that it intended to ban solar geoengineering activities. I'm not aware of any actual implementation of that, because such a regulation would require definitions. What is solar geoengineering? What is an activity? If I think about it as an activity, if I write a paper about law and ethics, is that an activity? Or must I physically inject some minimal amount of substance into the atmosphere? As far as I know, that was never actually advanced to the level of policy. I might be wrong.
I think what Jesse's describing brings up, I think, a starting question with governance, which is what's governance for? And governance could be to limit geoengineering, or governance could be provided to provide enabling environment to make it actually easier to go ahead with geoengineering activities. Most of the examples you gave were stopped not as a legal matter; they were stopped by, by public opinion, or by limited interest groups. There's a lot of conspiracy theory. There's a lot of fear of geoengineering. So in my view, it would be actually very beneficial to have governance at the national level that provides some reassurance that geoengineering research that's going on is not going to be rogue research, that there's going to be requirements for assessment, for transparency, for, the research is not going to be secret, and so forth and so on. And if there was more national legislation that provided really some enabling environment for research, that provided some guidelines or some guardrails for research, that might provide some reassurance to researchers that they can go ahead with research and it's going to have some social acceptability. I think now a lot of researchers are reluctant to really engage in research because there is a stigma attached to climate engineering research, and there's a lot of opposition by particular groups on, I think, ideological grounds against it. So there's a bad environment for actually being willing to engage in research. So I think having some kind of national program that had guardrails and so forth and so on that provided some legitimacy for the research would be actually a big step forward. I think that's really, in my mind, much more likely to happen than international governance, because I think international governance takes a huge amount of time to develop. I think governance at the national level would be a good first step and could then provide maybe a step towards eventually some kind of international structure, but would be a better place to start the conversation.
I think you're raising a really important point here, Dan, which kind of strikes back at the point I was making at the outset. And what you've just described is a process which is driven from the top, because that environment would be changed by policymakers, providing the funding or the green light generally to undertake that kind of research to overcome the reluctance that you refer to. But the politicians themselves and the policymakers are also victims of the same mindset that is out there more broadly. And you have to ask yourself the question, why would they pick up geoengineering as a cause célèbre and pursue that when they know that there's all of this stuff going on, in other levels, in other countries, and there's all this publicity, because the anti-geoengineering lobby has been very, very effective. I mean, they've got all sorts of very high profile and very definitive statements about all the terrible things that geoengineering might entail. So there is a kind of systemic issue here about how you break through to provide that environment for the researchers to do the work. And to me, that's where we get into this problem, that unless the policymakers somehow can be brought to understand that if we do not geoengineer in some form or another, and I'm completely agnostic about how it's done at this stage, because we need to do the research, but if geoengineering is not done, there is now a very high and increasing risk that this is all going to end in tears. And that risk is really becoming very, very unbalanced in favor of catastrophe as we proceed with our continuing failure to reduce emissions and the whole decarbonization activity, including removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. I mean, it's just, there's a lot of talk about it. There's even quite a lot of money in it, but actually it's not really happening at a scale and it's not accelerating at the speed that is necessary for it to really make any significant difference. So in my view, until geoengineering is perceived to be a necessary policy addition, not a just nice to have, it's going to be very difficult to get that change in mindset that you just referred to, Dan. I'd be interested in your and Jesse's views on that, because to me, that's the big blockage.
What I wonder is, do both of you agree with his point of view, which is I share, that if that the risk is increasing and the probability of catastrophe is much greater if we don't do geoengineering than if we do, just as a general principle, although it all depends on the details. But if other people still are of the opinion that it's a risky thing to do and maybe we should just keep waiting a while, then we know we're having a different kind of conversation. What's your view?
Well, the problem, I think, is I agree with everything Robert said. I think the problem is there's no political constituency right now in favor of geoengineering. The only sort of constituency that could exist would be the fossil fuel industry, which would be the worst possible proponents of geoengineering, because that would then be seen, I think rightly so, as just a way for them to try to avoid emission reductions, which are absolutely necessary. So the fossil fuel industry can't be the supporter of geoengineering. It's got to be the environmental community, because there are arguments for geoengineering that I think are legitimate, or for researching it, considering it as an option, are environmental issues. Because if we don't geoengineer, well, if we continue to just go along with what we're doing now, there's as Robert said, a very high chance of, very, very damaging levels of global warming. So I think the arguments for geoengineering are really environmental arguments. So it has to be the environmental community, but the environmental community is extremely slow to move off their fixed position. So, nuclear power for a long time was something you couldn't really talk about, even though it's a zero emitting technology or low, because there was a bias against nuclear power. For a long time, there was a bias against discussing adaptation, because adaptation was seen as being a way to avoid reducing emissions. And so it took a long time for the environmental community, I think, to embrace adaptation as something that was, something that we could really talk about. And I think they're having a similar problem, accepting geoengineering is something we can even talk about. But I think trying to bring them around is really, I think, critical. I don't know if it's possible, but it's critical to sort of create some political constituency in favor of geoengineering and make it so that policymakers actually are willing to, go ahead with research. That's probably less of a problem in a country like China, which, doesn't have to respond to political pressures. And so I have no idea. Jesse may know more than I or Robert about what they're doing in terms of research, but they don't have those political constraints. If they feel geoengineering could be useful for them to prevent dangerous climate change to China, they presumably will go ahead and fund the research. And I don't know if they're doing that or not.
And to build off of what Chris said, politicians, the policymakers, need to get on board with this difficult, unpleasant decision that we have a choice of, we have no best choice in front of us at this point in time. We don't have the first best. We don't have the second best. We're down to like the 10th best option with climate change. And the policymakers need to lead. But politicians tend not to lead. They tend to follow their voters and their influential constituencies. And as Dan said, there's no natural supporter of this. There's a few dozen academic researchers out there. It is, I think, the environmental groups that are important here. It's worth noting that in America, one of the major environmental groups, which has long quietly supported solar geoengineering research, this is Environmental Defense Fund, is now moving into it in a more active way, and has assigned some staffers to the issue and will be taking action, having some sort of program in the next couple years. The Natural Resources Defense Council, another major U.S. environmental group, also quietly supports solar geoengineering research. Most of the environmental groups that I'm aware of don't have a position because the politics aren't there. But I would go a step further and say there is a natural constituency for opposition to solar geoengineering. And at the very least, that's sort of an intuitive sense. I've never met anybody who heard the idea of solar geoengineering and said, that sounds great. Let's spray sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. It's an acid, of course. There's acid rain is great. We're mimicking volcanoes. We'll block out part of the sun and climate change will be solved. Nobody's thought that. Everybody understandably has this intuitive repulsion to this idea, especially those who are most concerned about climate change and most concerned about the environment. But if you start looking at the evidence closer and closer, it starts to resemble something like chemotherapy, where it's just an unpleasant decision to face, where a bit of poison in the long run might be better, although we don't know that. However, that's not politics, not known for subtleties. Politics tends not to be evidence-based, and there's a sufficient constituency out there that associates reducing emissions with other objectives. Dan mentioned a more natural world, less big technology, acting closer to nature. And there's this strong language as well as this broader societal transformation that gets wrapped up into aggressive emissions cuts, which starts to take on these objectives of redistributing wealth and power. That solar geoengineering would not address one way or the other. It may merely reduce the risks of climate change. So it creates difficult politics to advance in any constructive way.
Mhm.
And can I add something to that as well, Jesse? Because I think one of the critical details here is that the anti-geoengineering lobby, and this is not unique to this topic, to geoengineering, it applies all over the place with public policy generally. And that is that people argue about, well, we don't know, we don't have the information. We need to know that there'll be no negative consequences, that this is safe. And the word safety keeps coming up. But of course, the reality is that there is no public policy with a long-term and widespread impact that is ever implemented other than in a state of ignorance. Because we never know exactly how any policy is going to play out over time. And of course, the longer it plays out, the less control we have, the less able we are to predict exactly how it's going to play out, because there are so many factors in the future. You know, future people have agency, and we have no control over how they're going to behave. So it's impossible to draw any kind of line from a proposed policy into the future and say with confidence, this is going to be safe, or this is not going to be safe, or this is, all you can say is, this feels like a good idea. It feels like it's going to be more safe than not doing it. And this is the critical point, we are going to put into place processes to monitor outcomes. And as soon as anything looks like it's going pear-shaped, we'll intervene when the cost of remedial action will be at its lowest point. And that's how policy's always been done. You know, there are any number of policies across a whole wide range of communal activity in every country, where that's precisely what happens with education policy, with policing policy, with, you know, defense. That's what happens. That's what politicians do. They act, they make mistakes, it's observed, it's corrected, they change, and so on, things evolve. And there is no reason to suppose, in my view, that geoengineering wouldn't be exactly the same. We'd do it, we'd get some things right, we'd get some things wrong. The things that we got wrong, we'd improve on, we'd learn. And, you know, we'd get from Kitty Hawk, you know, from what was it, Wright's first aeroplane, you know, to the Concorde and to modern aircraft in a blink. You know, we can do that. We have a history of doing all sorts of things which at the outset sound crazy and highly dangerous. You know, if somebody had said 100 years ago, what we're going to do is we're going to pipe explosive gas into everybody's homes so they can burn it and keep warm. So you're mad. We're going to put electricity all the way around the world. It might electrocute people, it might cause fire, but they'd say you're crazy. But of course, we've learned how to do these things safely. And my guess is that geoengineering would be much the same. And if it wasn't, we wouldn't do it. But we'll never know unless we start.
Well, let's go back to the comment, which I think is true, that there is no existing constituency that is demanding it. And the question is, how do you get to such a constituency? I like the idea, and I want to try it out on you, of having a global citizens assembly that is truly representative of the people of the world, the entire human population. Do it by Zoom, have them deliberate for 6 months or a year at the most, maybe even not that long if they don't need to, but some length of time where they actually bring in experts and interrogate people one way or another on every point of view until they finally come to a point of view. And I think they're going to say, yeah, let's go ahead and at least experiment, but maybe start tentative deployment and then watch what happens as we go and stop it if there's a problem. I think that's what would happen if we got a citizens assembly that's truly representative of the human population. And I think there's some billionaires around who could easily afford to pay the shot for that. What do you think of that as a way of trying to stimulate acceptance of the idea?
Well, if my starting point is the limited public opinion polling that's been done on geoengineering, and the opinions are highly sensitive, of course, to question wording because it's a new topic. People know what taxes are, right? And people know what immigration is. You don't need those questions will be less sensitive to wording. Whereas this requires background, and is it geoengineering or is it solar radiation modification, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, surveys consistently show that populations across the world support solar geoengineering research. In terms of its eventual use, people tend to be pretty pessimistic, if not outright opposed at this time. But there is moderate support, moderate majority, let's say, support for research. It appears that it's slightly higher in developing countries. It's slightly higher in climate vulnerable countries. And that shouldn't be surprising. It tends to be slightly higher among younger people as well, which I think is also not terribly surprising. But there's also a role, of course, in policy making for delegation to experts. Not that, of course, that's what representatives are. We voters, we don't vote on all the decisions. We hand off the tough decisions to politicians, who in turn hand off at least some input into the process to expert committees and so forth. And it's worth noting that these expert committees on the topic of solar geoengineering, where they've existed, have also consistently said more research is needed. And whether that's the Royal Society of the UK or the US National Academies or the UN Environment Program had an expert report recently, they all point to insufficient knowledge and the need for more research.
So if I can make a comment on the Citizens Commission idea. I'm curious, are there examples of those kind of commissions and how successful have they been in changing the public discourse? I guess I think it's an intriguing idea, but I guess I would have a lot of questions. Who would be setting it up? How much trust there would be in the people setting it up? How much trust there would be that they're really representative? Who the commission would be influencing? Would the US Congress be likely to actually change its views if some World Commission set up by a Citizens Commission set up by Bill Gates, recommended geoengineering research? Would that really affect the domestic politics, which I think is what has to be changed? I think, a country like the US should have a national research program and some kind of provision that would include provisions that would provide the guardrails that I was talking about. So it's a question as to whether the commission would really change the discourse. As Jesse says, there's been quite a few public opinion surveys, including in developing countries, that show support for geoengineering research. I don't think they've really influenced the US environmental groups and their views on geoengineering. I don't think it's had much effect on the US political system, probably other countries as well. So I guess it's a question of how you actually get the political change that I think would be necessary to provide sort of the feeling of social license among researchers to go ahead and do more research. There is, I think, an improved environment. Jesse and Robert might have more knowledge of what's going on in the research community, but 10 or 15 years ago, there was almost nothing being done. Whereas now there's, quite a lot of discussion, quite a few reports. I have the feeling there are more researchers engaged in the actual physical science research. I remember I was at one of these geoengineering conferences. I think it was the one in 2012, also in Berlin, the predecessor ones. And they did a comparison of the number of papers written on the governance of geoengineering versus the number of social science papers versus the actual natural science papers. And there was this gigantic literature on governance of geoengineering and almost actually no scientific papers on the science of geoengineering. And I think that's just a huge imbalance, because I think where the research really needs to be done is understanding the science of geoengineering to understand better about, how there are different places you could do the injection. There are different altitudes you could do the injection. You could use different materials. There's just not a lot of knowledge of a lot of those basic science questions. It's not just a question of is it safe or not safe, but how could you do it most safely, or how could you do it with the least impacts on different countries? I just was at a meeting in Washington, D.C., where they were saying you need to do it at both poles simultaneously, because if you do it at one pole but not the other, that will have then worse effects. Or if you do it in equatorial, there are all these science questions that need to be addressed. And I have the feeling there actually is more science being done. So there's not as much of an imbalance between the social science and the science. So I think that's better, but there needs to be obviously much more research, I think.
I think the point you're making is absolutely right. But the difficulty that I have with all of this is that I don't see the impetus for doing the work coming until there is a much wider recognition that geoengineering is now really necessary. It's no longer a nice to have. We need to do this at some point, because the risk balance is now too far the other way. And you still have in the COPs, they don't talk about geoengineering there. There's nothing in the main international political agenda about geoengineering. There is this assumption, and well, actually it's not even an assumption, it's an assertion right the way through, that decarbonisation, reducing emissions and sucking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, are still, or could still be, sufficient. All right, we just got to work harder, we've got to do more of it. But we don't, that's enough. And so long as the view that is promoted by these international bodies, these senior and highly regarded international bodies, and I have to say, by a number of quite senior and well-placed academics in this space, that decarbonisation is sufficient, I think it's going to be very difficult to build this community to really invest time, effort, and money into the research that's necessary. You still have people, Tim Lenton and his team at Exeter, who are very, very highly regarded and have done a huge amount of fantastic work on tipping points and the threats that they present. They still are absolutely dead set against geoengineering. I mean, in their most recent report, they spend, it's a 500-page report all about these tipping points and how terrible it's all going to be. And yet the section that deals with geoengineering is a complete dismissal. We must not do this. It's quite unequivocal. We mustn't do this. And their solution is to encourage a whole bunch of what they call social positive tipping points to make the transition to renewables and all sorts of other things, reducing consumption, all of those behavior changes, more to build those into the way forward. Now, maybe that would work, I don't know, but it does seem to me that this essentially is a very risky way forward. And so long as you've got these very high profile individuals and institutions not coming out front and center and saying, look, guys, we are now really worried that decarbonisation is just not going to cut it. Until that happens, I think that getting geoengineering really on the agenda is going to be tough.
Yeah. So, if their social tipping points work, I'd be all in favor of them. So I think we should be pushing those as much as we can. But I think the question is, if they don't work, and I guess skeptical, having been following the climate issue now for more than 30 years and seeing how little actual change there's been in the emission trajectory of the world, I guess I'm skeptical of some of these that they'll actually be enough. So I think yes, I agree with you completely that we need to be researching geoengineering as to understand what the full range of options is. So yeah, but I think if I could bring it back a little bit to some of the ethical issues, I think some of the opposition to geoengineering, as I said before, is not really based on a risk analysis. It's sort of based on the idea that somehow geoengineering is, in my view, we're already geoengineering the climate. We're already changing the climate dramatically. And so I say, we're already geoengineering. So it's not geoengineering or not geoengineering. It's geoengineering to try to actually protect the climate system, or geoengineering, which we're doing already by our emissions, which is harming the climate system. But then people say, well, there's a difference between action and inaction. So somehow continuing to emit and not failing to stop emitting is somehow ethically better than trying to intervene in the climate system through geoengineering. And so I think some of the underlying opposition is based on, I think a lot of the ethicists who've written on geoengineering have been pretty negative about it. So I think trying to address why some of these ethical arguments, I think, don't really hold water is important too, because I think they provide some cover or some for groups that are opposing geoengineering. I think there's also a huge skepticism of technology. And so there's a huge emphasis now in the climate community for nature-based solutions. And somehow nature-based solutions are better than technology solutions, but nature-based solutions are great. But I guess I respond usually by saying, well, we didn't really want to rely on nature-based solutions to COVID. We actually liked a highly technological solution to COVID, which was the vaccines, or at least just people who are vaccine users like myself saw technology there as a huge benefit. So, and I think in terms of emission reduction, there's also a huge emphasis on technologies, renewables, and so forth. So why there's somehow this deep mistrust of any kind of technological solution that would involve reflecting sunlight, I think is very questionable from a philosophical standpoint.
I think, at least adjacent to ethical issues, but somewhat stepping back to the political dynamic, is to look critically at the tactics of the ideological opponents of geoengineering. And they, for one thing, look at one side of the ledger. Dan usefully, repeatedly speaks of a risk framework. You got to look at both sides of the ledger. You can't just look at cost and no benefit, or look at benefits and no cost. One must look at both sides of the ledger. Second, these opponents of geoengineering research cherry pick data. I mean, of course, evidence is noisy, and you can always find data that points. You can look at 1,000 studies and find the 10 that point in the direction that's consistent with your priors, with your prior assumptions, with your prior values. And third, they reject proposed response based upon its wider social and political implications. Yet those three behaviors are precisely what characterized, at least, climate deniers, right? They cherry-picked data. They looked at one side of the ledger, and they rejected a response based upon its broader social and economic impacts, right? And I think it's fascinating that there's a correlation, turning back again to public opinion polling, that at least among, that those who are in the developed world, in the global north, we all are in Europe and North America, those who are more concerned about climate change are less supportive of geoengineering research on average. And I think it's a fascinating question why that might be, right? And I think it's tied into a type of an absence of confrontation. Of course, Robert called for a need to come to terms with the potential of geoengineering. Heck, I'd be happy with coming to terms with where we are with climate change, with emissions cuts, an honest conversation that, according to the UN Environment Program emissions gap report, that even making the most optimistic assumption about policies, there is a 14% chance that emissions cuts and carbon removal can keep global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet we have the Secretary General of the United Nations, perhaps the most influential figure in the world on this issue, who year after year opens up the climate COP by saying we need to keep 1.5 alive. I don't see how 1.5 can be kept alive merely with emissions cuts and CDR if one were to take a reasonable, careful, precautious approach to risk management.
Mhm. Do we all agree on that? I think it's true.
I mean, of course, let me just also add, it is too early to know whether solar geoengineering would be a net benefit in terms of a net reducer of environmental harm in a way that would be have acceptable side effects. It's too early. Fortunately, that's not the question in front of us right now. At least in front of policymakers right now. The question in front of policymakers is, should research be supported? Should there be dedicated research grants? Should there be expectations, clarity on what degree of responsibility and transparency and public engagement are expected from solar geoengineering researchers? And those signals do need to come from the policymakers that Robert pointed to.
So I think there's a really interesting question of social psychology, which is way outside my area of expertise. But I think there is actually, widespread despair that we actually will deal with climate change. Young people, some people don't want to have babies anymore because they see the world as, a disaster ahead of them. So, but there's kind of, the reaction seems to be kind of fatalism, that we're condemned to having, a horrible climate, an extinction level event, which I don't think is true, but climate catastrophe is a meme that's now very popular. So I think there's pretty widespread acceptance by many people of climate catastrophe as something that's inevitable. But then there's an unwillingness to look at what are the potential options for actually averting climate catastrophe, which would be the use of solar geoengineering if it's shown to be safe and effective. So I find it a very interesting psychological question why the people who are probably most despairing of the climate system, to the point where they don't really see any future, aren't like providing that political constituency in favor of, trying everything is conceivable, including solar geoengineering as a way to try to avert catastrophe. It's very odd to say there's a catastrophe, but we're going to take this potential way of dealing with it off the table. We're going to take that potential way of dealing with it. If it's a catastrophe, then you should be, throwing everything you can think of at the problem to try to avert the catastrophe. That's at least my
view. You say that, Dan. One of the interesting developments in that area is that the Extinction Rebellion people, which started in the UK, they were extremely opposed to geoengineering initially. In fact, for most of the time, but not. I think earlier this year, I think it was, you might recall, that the founders of Extinction Rebellion actually apologized in writing to their community, saying we were misled. And actually, we now believe that geoengineering is essential.
Wow.
So, well, that's very encouraging.
Great.
I think we need to convince, if we could convince Greta Thunberg of the need to, and she became a voice in favor of research, not deployment, but research to see, that would be a huge change. So the fact that Extinction Rebellion has changed their view is maybe quite an encouraging sign.
Well, why not? I mean, I think we're coming to the end of our conversation, but I want to know, what is the most promising way to invest our time in trying to make this thing happen? My concern is how to influence public opinion, and I don't know how. I tried this and tried that, but one thing is, if you can get celebrities, somebody should get Taylor Swift to say she believes in geoengineering. Yes, Greta would be perfect. Has anybody tried to talk to this young woman and persuade her? I would love to see somebody actually have a good conversation with her about it.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe the Extinction Rebellion people who now apologize would have the credibility to get a meeting with Greta Thunberg and explain why they've changed their view, and
Mhm.
maybe that would be persuasive to her.
And I don't know what to say about Greta Thunberg or even Extinction Rebellion right now, but there's a type of a dissonance, if you will, like a cognitive dissonance among those who are most concerned about climate change and stridently opposed to the consideration and the research of solar geoengineering. And that dissonance will become increasingly difficult to sustain as the years go on. And it's one thing in 2010 to say that emissions cuts and maybe carbon removal can prevent dangerous climate change. It's now 2024. And atmospheric CO2 is at what, 415 or something like that. I don't keep a close track.
Mhm.
The prospect is much less dim, and I think it's going to be some interesting years ahead of us.
So I wrote my first paper on geoengineering back in 1995. And so it's been almost 30 years, and there's been extremely little progress. So if there's, we need a step change in the level of progress, because if we wait another 30 years and make some very modest incremental advance, it's going to be too late. So hopefully.
Dan, if that paper that you wrote in 1995 was the one that was published in Climate Change in 1996, I was rereading it this afternoon because it was one that I quoted in my PhD thesis. So and this is a great opportunity to thank you.
Well, I don't think we've come to a solution, and I'm not surprised. I haven't heard any solutions yet, and I've been talking to people quite a bit about it. So I don't really hold my breath, but let's, I think, put our minds to exactly the question of how to change public opinion enough so that we get some, mobilization of a constituency that really demands, not only favors it, but actually demands some move in that direction. I'd love to participate in such a group. So anybody who wants to organize one will count me in. All right. We've done it, fellas. That's all for today. Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure and fun. It's just in a way discouraging too, isn't it? Okay, carry on.
Thank you.
Thank you.